brought to you by South Dublin Libraries. We have lots of fantastic events going on during the week. So if you want some information on any of our other events, go to redlinebookfestival.ie. So I have a couple of housekeeping announcements to make. Firstly, in case of a fire, your fire exits are to the side, left and right here, and up at the top of the stairs and left and right. Also, can I ask everybody to turn your phones off? So without further ado, can I welcome Ricochet, Selina Guinness, and Emily Hourican to the stage, who are going to talk about books during the 1920s as part of our 1920s book club. Thank you.
We're getting way ahead of ourselves here. Let's start at the very beginning. Hello, people in a real room. People who are, you have no idea, we've been having this conversation backstage just before we started. The idea of, I counted it up earlier on today, it has been 586 days since the last time I interviewed a human being in front of a room full of people. In the interim, I've done probably over 100 interviews, all sitting in front of my laptop in my spare bedroom, which is sapping my will to live. No offense to the people watching on the internet, by the way. Hello, people on the internet. I'm sitting here, I'm fine now. I'm in a lovely room full of fantastic people who've turned out on a Wednesday night. Thank you for coming out on a Wednesday night as well. Thank you for coming. Thank you for getting involved in this. It's an interesting event. We've tons to talk about. We're going to have readings from some of the books as well. Hello to everybody who is watching online, because we're told there are tons of book clubs around the country who are all watching. We can't see you, but hello, how are you? I'm absolutely sure that you're all there. We will do questions at the end of this. There'll be a Q&A, and we'll try and leave plenty of time for that, because sometimes it gets a little bit lost. So I'm fairly sure, from the look of you, that you are the sort of people who've brought your questions tonight. I'm not wrong in that, am I? I kind of, you can't put your hand up yet, sir, but believe me, take your time. We'll have plenty of time for that later. Okay. I'm going to start, Emily, with you, maybe. Tell me about why that period, why your interest, and how you come to then write the Glorious Guinness Girls book. What's the thread that leads you all the way through into that?
So, first, as Rick says, hi. Amazing to see people in a room. Thank you all for coming. And why I got to the Glorious Guinness Girls was so two separate strands. Firstly, I have been obsessively reading in the 1920s from the time, I think, when I first picked up Vile Bodies. I must have been about 14, maybe 15. And I read an awful lot of Evelyn Waugh. I moved on then to reading a lot of Nancy Mitford. I read obsessively in the 1920s, and what I loved about them were the parties, the glamour, the excitement, the sequins, the feathers, the cocktails. It seemed to me, as a 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old, very keen to go to parties and, meet lots of really glamorous people, that was what real life, grown-up life, looked like at its most exciting. And I was really dazzled by it. And then later, as I became much older and began to study history much more, the historical context of the 1920s began to blow me away at least as much as the excitement of the era had done. When I began reading about the First World War and the misery that was, and looking at the ways that the explosion of energy in the 1920s came out of the misery, the blood and guts of the First World War, and the carnage of that war, and how the 1920s was this huge collective societal response to that event, that bizarre and appalling happening, that just made it more interesting for me. So then when I decided I wanted to write about the Guinness Girls lived right the way through the 20th century. Eileen was born in 1904. She died in 1999. I could have picked any point, really, to start writing about them. But the minute I knew that they had lived through the 1920s, I knew that was where I wanted to get into their lives. And then I began looking up the newspaper archives of the time and finding that these real people who I had got so interested in were really at all of these parties that I had been reading the fictional representations of, as written by Evelyn Waugh and others. And the combination was just irresistible. I mean, who could have stayed away from that? Definitely not me.
It's an interesting one in that, so far as you said you were, what, maybe kind of 13, 14, 15 when you came across that. How do you stumble across books like that when you're that age? Because, for a lot of kids, certainly for when I was that age, I was reading Famous Five, Secret Seven. I kind of started reading some Arthur C. Clarke as well. But was there a reason as to why you found yourself in that world to begin with?
I think it was probably the same reason that an awful lot of kids read stuff that's probably inappropriate for them. And loads of it would have gone totally over my head. The books were there. They were just there. And they were on bookshelves, and Val Bodies was quite slim. And an awful lot of the books in our house were not slim. They were incredibly fat with really small type and kind of forbidding kind of oil portraits on the front cover, whereas Val Bodies was very kind of... It looked amusing. There was a little sketch on the cover. It was quite slight. And it's a book that dives into its story really, really quickly. So that was why. And then once I read that, I was completely hooked. And exactly, there it is. That's the...
You've got a flapper.
Yeah. You've got a girl looking glamorous and pretty on the cover. And loads of it I would have missed. I would have missed the darker side of it completely. And of all of those books, completely, until I began rereading them then in my much later 20s and 30s. And even recently I read them and I think, wow, I didn't pick up on that the first time, or I didn't really understand it.
Selina, the obvious question is about your surname and whether or not you have a connection that goes all the way back to this. Do you?
I'm by no means a glorious Guinness girl.
I
just want to say that first and foremost. We're from the really, really boring branch of the Guinness family that did decent things like church, and they went into the church basically to pray very hard for the souls of their younger brothers who went into the more profitable banking and brewing. So we're really dull. Obviously, we're really dull. So these kind of glamorous cousins who are somewhere pegged on a family tree are... they're kind of out there in the ether as much for me as they are for you, I think. So in that sense, no. I have been to Knockmaroon, which is one of sister house to the one that you mentioned, but only in the last 7 or 8 years. And my grandmother was very friendly with Brian Guinness.
Oh, right.
So in that sense, there were connections, but they are several generations back. So... Does that answer that?
It does. It does, and I had to. And tell me then, what's your gateway into literature of the 1920s? Where does it start for you?
Actually, it's really interesting to hear Emily talk about kind of the books that were on the shelves in the house. I live in a house that belonged to my grandmother and my uncle, and they had Evelyn Waugh, they had Agatha Christie. I think I received the Agatha Christie omnibus when I was about 9 or 10. Now, it wasn't all her novels, you can imagine. But it was a good selection. So that's when I think I also started to read, and again, it would be very similar, Waugh, Mitford. And it's funny because one of the things about those kind of 1920s books is that the 1920s in Irish literature happens in a completely different way to the 1920s in British literature. And really, this kind of circle of bright young things, and I know that we're going to talk about Gatsby a little bit later, and that's a kind of bright young thing in an American context. One of the things I've only recently realised is that Britain came out of the Great War as a victor, but completely financially bankrupt. And all of these kind of aristocratic families that populate these novels, one of the real problems is that they kind of have the assets and are desperate for cash in some ways, but there hasn't been a revolution as there has been in Ireland. So there hasn't been a transfer of land. So those landed estates remain intact, whereas in Ireland, through the Land Commission, that kind of landed class has been completely uprooted. So the experience in Ireland is one of that profound dislocation. And what you have instead is a sense of kind of, oh my God, moral decline. Like Evelyn Waugh was slightly panicked, I think, by the moral decline of the bright young things around him.
Yeah.
He's an Anglo-Catholic and very, very proper. And while he's partying hard, I think there is a sort of slight sense of anxiety about it.
Definitely.
So, That's probably a long, digressive answer, but that's where I'm at. Yeah.
It's interesting as well, and maybe I'm going to digress from what I was going to ask, but I was thinking about this earlier today. A lot of the books that we looked at in this list and that are in the original list, obviously they deal with the UK, they deal with the United States. Ireland is a very, very different place in the 1920s than obviously the United States is or than the UK is. And if you were to ask people possibly about books that have affected them that were written set in Ireland in the 1920s, almost all of them have the backdrop of the Civil War and have the backdrop of the years that then follow that. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to cocktails, flappers and jazz.
No. But I mean, you still have that, actually, that kind of the shadows of flappers, cocktails and jazz, even in like Yeats's great poems, Meditations in Time of Civil War, with that sense of ancestral houses. There's a section on ancestral houses, and there is a kind of sense of and obviously The Last September has this deeply shadowed sense of parties and privilege and prestige. I think one of the things that kind of Ireland is about state building in the 1920s, about how do you build a state. England is about how do you continue to finance a dying way of life, which is an aristocracy. And America is about making massive amount of capitalist money work. And for the British, America is where they're looking to finance their old aristocracy, isn't that right?
So the heiresses.
Yeah,
that's right.
The heiresses is where you have to go and find an heiress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because maybe this can lead into what I did want to ask you about, which is overarching themes in the books that we're going to talk about tonight. There are some that occur through 2, 3 or 4 of those books. We've already kind of started on the idea of old money, big houses, of the fall of that kind of lifestyle. That's a theme that runs through some of those books. Do either of you, maybe Emily, do you want to talk about a couple more of them that run through some of the other books that we're going to talk about tonight?
Yes. I'm really bad at overarching themes. So the Gatsby, which is one that I'm going to do a little reading from in a while, every time I read this book, it's a different book. And I have read it at least 4 times and possibly more. And again, it's that thing of reading as a child and just being or not a child, but a young teenager, being so dazzled by the romance of Gatsby and his quest for Daisy that I couldn't see anything else really in the book, except that it was only a novel of characters for me and a novel of romance and this hopeless, this quixotic romance and this quixotically romantic figure. And then reading it again, I go, no, it's a novel about the American dream. It's the novel that gives the lie to the American dream idea. So the Jazz Age didn't come out of a devastating war in the way that the Roaring 1920s in London did. The Jazz Age was something different. Scott Fitzgerald claims that he coined the phrase the Jazz Age, and everybody else disputes this. But he certainly, that is the great novel of the Jazz Age. It wasn't the same reaction to the awfulness of a war. It was much more forward propelled than that. It was the idea of having everything, of making insane amounts of money, getting the beautiful girl that you loved, setting up in your amazing house on Long Island and living happily ever after. And the novel thwarts poor Gatsby in doing this. It gives him all the money, and then it takes everything from him. So the overarching theme of that very much seems to be, to me anyway, firstly, it's this idea that the American dream is a lie, that this notion that anyone from anywhere can have anything they want simply by wanting and working hard enough is a lie. I think we all know that that's a lie now. But the other thing that I didn't see in Gatsby when I read it first is the awfulness of the romance, the childishness of the romance. This is not a mature man who loves a woman who he knows. This is somebody who is kind of half a man. He's a creation of his own. He's not a full person, falls in love with somebody who he doesn't know, proceeds to behave in a completely ridiculous, albeit very kind of charming and lovable way, and manages to drag all of these people into this awful series of events in which he ends up, spoiler alert, dead. Maybe I shouldn't.
It's been a century, I think we're fine.
Okay, okay. But also, and this was published in 1925, so in no way did Scott Fitzgerald know when he was writing it what was going to happen to the end of the 1920s, which ended horribly. But I always feel that it kind of emotionally prefigures what came about. At the end of the 1920s, ended in the appallingness of the Great Depression in the 1930s. There was the Great Wall Street crash. That was it. It was all over, and it was horrific. And I always feel that the end of Gatsby feels very like the end of the 1920s. All of that gorgeous excess, bang, dead.
There are other darker themes that run throughout all of this as well. Everything from the gender politics of the time all the way up to, if you want to start talking about eugenics as well.
Yeah, great. Can we stick with Gatsby for a minute?
We can.
It's such a lovely,
before I drag everything to the
book,
darkness,
right?
please. Yeah.
No, it's going to be dark. I mean, there's interesting subcurrents within the novel. First of all, reading, you say, you read it again and see a different thing. So I read it again and thought, oh my God, of course it is Donald Trump. I mean, a slimmed down blonde, he's a bootlegger. He's involved in fixing things. His money is ill-gotten wealth. He's absolutely invented himself. He was Jimmy Gatz. He's now Jay Gatsby. He's, got all the accoutrements of Trump Tower / large Hotel de Ville on Long Island. He's, wooing his girl with his money. But there's also the fact that Daisy is Southern, and she's from Kentucky, she's from Louisville, and you've got Tom Buchanan there as an idea of, if you like, kind of planter aristocracy, which is also profoundly racist, and which comes out in Tom kind of saying at various points of crisis, he says, but of course, it's important that the white, that were white.
Yeah, he's a white supremacist.
He's a white supremacist,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
and that's there in the novel. And what's interesting is that Nick Carraway, the narrator, is, his access into this comes via his dad's money has been made in hardware. And so, in a sense, Nick Carraway is sympathetic to the garage owner, Wilson, whose wife, Myrtle, Tom will have a tragic love affair with. But in a way, they're kind of similar figures, Nick Carraway and Mr. Wilson. But Nick Carraway has managed to kind of come into the orbit of this new cash and managed to make something of himself, whereas Mr. Wilson is in the ash pits on the way to New York. So this sense that actually the last line of, the great reveal of the book for Nick Carraway is that, the likes of Jay Gatsby and the likes of Tom Buchanan, they don't care for the little people. They're going to throw them by the wayside. So, it's quite a kind of dark portrait, I think, of oligarchic, criminal, new wealth exploitation, really.
Yes.
And now that you've said the T word, I'm never going to be able to think of the book in the same way again.
I mean, I know he might look, I know Leonardo DiCaprio looks very different. I do accept that, but... And
tell me, in terms of some of the other themes then running through these other books that we're about to talk about.
So one of the things I was quite interested in thinking about this period was there's a fantastic history by a guy called Richard Overy, he's a brilliant historian, and it's called This Morbid Age, and it moves between the 1920s and the 1930s. And I thought, kind of little framing details were that in the 1920s, the first popular edition, first popular guide to psychoanalysis was published, right? So Freud's work is suddenly kind of coming out and being talked about. By 1926, the London Centre of Psychoanalysis has been founded. And of course, you've got all these shell-shocked soldiers, if I can say that, it's a bit of a tongue twister, shell-shocked soldiers coming out of the First World War in the trenches who need treatment. But the other thing that is also really worrying people is this kind of sense that in the Great War, the flower of manhood, of British manhood, got lost. And what you have is these wild, irresponsible creatures who were too young to go through the war, but who effectively are now, if you like, the heirs of this kind of bankrupt, victorious country. And the part of the moral panic, and people like Mary Stopes, comes about because all those returning soldiers with shell shock, a lot of them had VD. And by 1931, there are 2.6 million patients in the UK being treated for venereal disease.
Jesus.
In 1931 alone, that year.
Not information you thought you were going to get at this event tonight?
I'm just saying, I never knew that.
So the kind of, the bright young things excess So you have this kind of moral panic, which is also related to kind of, again, like in Gatsby, a slight sense of racial decline is what they're worried about. That's Richard Overy's argument, it's not mine.
And there's a lot of drinking. I mean, there again, the darkness, etc. I mean, in Vile Bodies, his kind of main character, Agatha Runcible, is very much based on a real person whose name was Elizabeth Ponsonby, who I actually have written lots about in the Glorious Guinness Girls, because her life just seemed so extraordinarily void of anything except the organising to and preparing for and going to parties. And so Agatha Runcible in Vile Bodies is wonderful fun and hilarious, and there's never a party without Agatha, and it's all absolutely wonderful. And she ends the book she has a breakdown, she has a car crash, and then she goes away somewhere. I mean, she has a total breakdown. In real life, the real Elizabeth Ponsonby died at 42, I think it was, and died of alcoholism, according to her brother. So all of this, kind of this joyful incarnation of party going and this immense effort that they put into things like deciding on themes for their parties, American parties, black and white parties, dress up as a baby party, circus parties. I mean, everything had a theme. Everybody had these elaborate costumes. Everything looked amazing. And it got more and more tawdry as the decade wore on, and the people got older and sadder and more crippled by the addictions. There was an awful lot of drug use at that time as well. In London, mostly facilitated by a really interesting Irish woman called Kate Merrick, who ran a series of nightclubs and married all her daughters to dukes, but was a totally disreputable person herself and furnished an awful lot of the opium that was used. She also, I mean, Evelyn Waugh's clubs are based by and large on the clubs that she used to run. So that also is, it gets darker, it gets sadder, and it gets more desperate as time gets on. And what I always feel in all of these books, particularly when you look at the party scenes, is this massive lack of agency that people seem to have in their lives. They all feel like they are simply swept up in this tidal wave of frivolity, which is the flip side of this desperation and this awful loss. I mean, these, the people that Evelyn Waugh writes about, they were too young to fight in the war, but a lot of them had older brothers who fought and died. They had fathers, they had cousins. Loss was everywhere. I mean, death was everywhere. And the decision to turn their face away from that and look at something else, I feel that there's a real sense of them being caught up in something that is absolutely beyond their control, and they are swept along, and things simply happen to them, particularly in Vile Bodies. Like, nobody seems able to put the brakes on anything long enough to make a decision or do anything. They're just moving forward constantly on another wave of parties. Okay,
a decision has been made. I was going to say we've made a decision. I haven't. It's your decision because this is your event. That for the main part of this, we're going to look at a lot of these books through the lens of parties, specifically because they do tend to show the society that is going on around all of these characters. They show things about those characters themselves. Selina, maybe just if you can give us a brief idea of how that's going to work.
Okay, so there is actually a whole study around modernist parties, because the parties that were thrown during the 1920s, as Emily has outlined, were also very artistic and creative events in part. They were like kind of miniature theatre spectacles. But this idea of also freedom of young people to meet each other potentially unchaperoned, there's a kind of two-party party system in the 1920s. There's the season, which you write about wonderfully, which is girls in white dresses being presented to kings and queens in a succession of, titled balls. And then there's the after-party parties, which are the ones that you really want to go to. Yeah? So they're kind of, front of house and back of house, I suppose. And they kind of get wilder and wilder, as you've indicated. So we thought that if we looked at parties coming out of lockdown, that would be quite exciting. But also that the other thing that I suppose I was thinking about was that if you go into even kind of more po-faced literature, I suppose, like Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway says of herself, her only talent was for throwing parties. She could get people to mix. And so you have part of it is a thing about what are women for in the 1920s. You know, you can flower arrange, you can get people into dinner, you know, you can throw an event. You know, these are the kind of skills that, again, for this tier of society that we're talking about in these books, like in Wodehouse and the rest, this is what is valued. So that is why we are talking about parties, and we have a variety of parties to bring you to this evening. We're inviting everyone.
Okay, you've asked me, and I've never done this before, but because I haven't done one of these in a really long time, I'm totally thrilled to.
Okay.
We're going to have some readings from some of these books, and I'm going to read something from P.G. Wodehouse, just to begin with. We're starting at the very beginning?
We're starting at the beginning,
Let's start at the very beginning. I'm not going to attempt my best Stephen Fry accent. Now, touching this business of old Jeeves, my man, you know, how do we stand? Lots of people think I'm much too dependent on him. My Aunt Agatha, in fact, has even gone so far as to call him my keeper. Well, what I say is, why not? The man's a genius. From the collar upward, he stands alone. I gave up trying to run my own affairs within a week of his coming to me. That was about half a dozen years ago, directly after the rather rummy business of Florence Cray, my Uncle Willoughby's book, and Edwin the Boy Scout. The thing I really began when I got back to Easby, my uncle's place in Shropshire. I was spending a week or so there, as I generally did in the summer, and I had to break my visit to come back to London to get a new valet. I'd found Meadows, the fellow I'd taken to Easby with me, sneaking my silk socks, a thing no bloke of spirit could stick at any price. It was transpiring, moreover, that he had looted a lot of other things here and there about the place. I was reluctantly compelled to hand the misguided blighter the mitten and go to London to ask the registry office to dig up another specimen for my approval. They sent me Jeeves. I shall always remember the morning he came. It so happened that the night before I'd been present at a rather cheery little supper, and I was feeling pretty rocky. On top of this, I was trying to read a book Florence Cray had given me. She'd been one of the house party at Easby, and 2 or 3 days before I left, we'd got engaged. I was due back at the end of the week, and I knew she'd expect me to have finished the book by then. You see, she was particularly keen on boosting me up a bit nearer her own plane of intellect. She was a girl with a wonderful profile, but steeped to the gills in serious purpose. I can't give you a better idea of the way things stood than by telling you that the book she'd given me to read was Types of Ethical Theory, and that when I opened it at random, I stuck a page beginning, the postulate or common understanding involved in speech is certainly coextensive in the obligation it carries with the social organism of which language is the instrument and the ends of which it is an effort to subserve. All perfectly true, no doubt, but not the sort of thing to spring on a lad with a morning head. I was doing my best to skim through this bright little volume when the bell rang. I crawled off the sofa and opened the door. A kind of darkish, sort of respectful Johnny stood without. I was sent by the agency, sir, he said. I was given to understand the required valet. I'd have preferred an undertaker, but I told him to stagger in, and he floated noiselessly through the doorway like a healing zephyr. That impressed me from the start. Meadows had flat feet and used to clump. This fellow didn't seem to have any feet at all. He just steamed in. He had a grave, sympathetic face, as if he too knew what it was to sup with the lads. Excuse me, sir, he said gently. Then he seemed to flicker and wasn't there any longer. I heard him moving about in the kitchen, and presently he came back with a glass on a tray. If you would drink this, sir, he said, with a kind of bedside manner, rather like the royal doctor shooting the bracer into the sick prince. It's a little preparation of my own invention. It's the Worcester sauce that gives it its colour. The raw egg makes it nutritious. The red pepper gives it its bite. Gentlemen have told me they found it extremely invigorating after a late evening. I would have clutched at anything that looked like a lifeline that morning. I swallowed the stuff. For a moment, I felt as if somebody had touched off a bomb inside the old bean and was strolling down my throat with a lighted torch. And then everything seemed suddenly to get all right. The sun shone in through the window, birds twittered in the treetops, and generally speaking, hope dawned once more. You're engaged, I said, as soon as I could say anything. I perceived clearly that this cove was one of the world's workers, the sort no home should be without. Thank you, sir. My name is Jeeves. You can start at once? Immediately, sir. And if that doesn't convince you to read the rest of it, nothing will. Tell me where you're going to go with your first reading. We're staying in London, but it's the London of Evelyn Waugh's Vile Bodies.
Yeah, okay, so we're slightly cheating here because Evelyn Waugh's Vile Bodies was published in 1930, isn't that right? But it absolutely is about the world that you write out of in terms of the Glorious Guinness Girls and a hint of Scandal, the new one. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you out on a party which Bertie Wooster might have attended prior to Jeeves entering his life. I think Jeeves probably wouldn't have allowed him to continue the party in quite the same way as these. They're all slightly unparented, aren't they, these creatures that we're talking about there. They're all slightly unparented. So the evening has kind of worn on at a succession of parties, and Agatha Runcible, who has been nicely introduced by Emily, is a girl who, by this stage, is already quite notorious. She's notorious from the first page onwards because she has been rather grotesquely manhandled by a customs officer and made a complaint, and that has got onto the front papers. And so they go from party to party, and then they try to get to Agatha Runcible's house, but she's lost her latchkey. And at that moment, one of the party that no one's paid any attention to, a little woman called Miss Brown, suddenly speaks up and kind of basically says, "You can come to my house." So they all get into taxis and they go through London at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and they don't really know where they're going because they've all drunk so much. And they turn up in this house, this rather sombre dining room. They have glasses of whiskey and soda. They have this party of people. They have with them a gossip columnist from one of the papers called Vanbrugh. Anyway, Miss Brown is rather, this is her first big evening out, and she's rather delighted that everyone has ended up back at her place. It was a lovely evening for Miss Brown. Flushed with successful hospitality, she trotted from guest to guest, offering here a box of matches, there a cigar, there a fruit from the enormous gilt dishes on the sideboard. To think that all these brilliant people whom she had heard so much about, with what envy from Miss Mouse, should be here in Papa's dining room calling her my dear and darling. And when at last they said they really had to go, Miss Runcible said, "Well, I can't go because I've lost my latchkey. Do you mind awfully if I sleep here?" And Miss Brown, her heart in her mouth, but in the most natural way possible, said, "Oh, of course not, Agatha, darling, that would be divine." And then Miss Runcible said, "Oh, how too divine of you, rapture." So that's as the evening ends. But the next day, it has to be explained that Miss Runcible is wearing a hula girl outfit, and that's all. And she stays overnight and she trots down to breakfast. And so what happens at breakfast is that she pops her head in, and Mrs. Brown is sitting with her 4 very polite daughters eating breakfast. And into this midst, Jane's father appears and says to his wife, "Martha, the most extraordinary thing. I think I must be losing my reason. I was in my study just now, going over that speech for this afternoon, when suddenly the door opened, and in came a sort of dancing Hawaiian woman, half naked. It just said, 'Oh, how shy-making,' and then disappeared. And, oh, for he had suddenly caught sight of Miss Runcible. 'Oh, how do you do? I don't think you have met my husband before.' 'Only for a second,' said Miss Runcible. I hope you slept well,' said Jane's father desperately. 'Martha never told me we had a guest. Forgive me if I appeared inhospitable. Oh, why doesn't somebody else say something?' Miss Runcible, too, was feeling the strain. She picked up the morning paper. 'Oh, here's something terribly funny,' she said by way of making conversation. 'Shall I read it to you? Midnight orgies at number 10. My dear, isn't that divine? Listen. What must be the most extraordinary party of the little season took place in the small hours of this morning at number 10 Downing Street. At about 4 a.m., the policemen, who are always posted outside the Prime Minister's residence, were surprised to witness, isn't this too amusing, the arrival of a fleet of taxis from which emerged a gay throng in exotic fancy dress. How I should have loved to have seen it. Can't you imagine what they were like? the hostess of what was described by one of the guests as the brightest party the bright young people have yet given was no other than Miss Jane Brown, the youngest of the Prime Minister's 4 lovely daughters. The Honourable Agatha. Why, what an extraordinary thing. Oh, my God. Suddenly light came flooding in on Miss Runcible's mind, as once when, in her debutante days, she had gone behind the scenes at a charity matinee and returning had stepped through the wrong door and found herself in a blaze of floodlights on the stage in the middle of the last act of Othello. Oh, my God, she said, looking round the brown breakfast table. Isn't that just too bad of Vanbrugh? He's always doing that kind of thing. It really would serve him right if we complained and he lost his job. Don't you think so, Sir James? Or don't you? Miss Runcible paused and met the eyes of the Brown family once more. Oh, dear, she said. This really is all too bogus. Then she turned round and, trailing garlands of equatorial flowers, fled out of the room and out of the house to the huge delight and profit of the crowd of reporters and press photographers who were already massed around the historic front door.
And again, if you haven't read Vile Bodies yet and that doesn't convince you, nothing will. It would seem very strange to have you here, Emily, and have you not read something from one of the Guinness Girls' books. Tell us a little bit about the role that parties play in the books, and then maybe you'll read us a little something.
Okay, so in the first book, which is not this one, this is the second book, set in the 1930s. The first one, in the 1920s, parties have a really big role to play, both in terms of bringing people into the same room, the pure mechanics of getting people into the same room and getting lots of them, and a believable sequence of events that moves the action on is the kind of boring answer to that. But the real function that I think that they serve is they kind of punctuate the years. So the book spans about 12 or 13 years, of which 10, obviously, are within the 1920s. From the very beginning, it ends in 1930. And there are parties at pivotal moments that I use to show the progression of the decade. So in the beginning, when they are first encountering the exciting parties of the bright young people, as opposed to the season, that you were talking about, which is so staid and so snobbish and so boring and involves, in one case, at a particularly famous ball called Queen Charlotte's Ball, curtsying to a cake. The cake represented Queen Charlotte, and everybody filed down the stairs in a white dress and they curtsied to the cake. And they were so awful, and they were also so they were so watched. So everybody was watching to see, were you a successful debutante? Did the boys like you? Because that was the only metric of success for a girl at that stage. Even when she was as rich as the Guinness girls, it was still, do the boys like you? Do the right boys like you? And so everybody's watching, and they're so awkward and really, really kind of unfun. And so that then, I do a couple of those, and then I move into the enormous fun of the kind of bohemian fancy dress parties, which were really creative. I know that I did them, I did them down earlier, but they were also a great creative outpouring and this great kind of mixing of people. They were very bohemian. There were all sorts of people. They weren't just the aristocracy. And so there's this great feeling of excitement and promise, and there's jazz music, and, there's a more multicultural scene, if you can call it that. And there's huge promise to them. And then that kind of peaks in about, I think it was 1926, the Bath and Bottle Party, which was a very famous party of its time. And it was the point at which the press began to turn on these people.
You just say where the Bath and Bottle Party was held.
In St. George's swimming baths. So in a public swimming pool. And with the water all in the pool. And by the end of the night, the water was so filthy and so full of broken glass and kind of floating miserable bits of old garland and people's clothes and stuff. And everybody who was at the party, who had started the night looking beautiful and gorgeous, came out into the light of day with buses full of people going to work, going past them on the road outside, very, very bedraggled. And that was the moment at which there began to be a switch. So the great press interest and indulgence in these young people and what they were doing began to turn around, and there was this increasing note of, we don't like this, we find that these people are irresponsible and immoral, and actually they're dragging the whole country down with them. And so that was, the tolerance was worn out at that stage. So that's the kind of downward, the beginning of the downward curve for the whole 1920s scene that I put into a party, because it seemed to me the most effective way, and also the most fun way, to kind of show what was happening socially around all of this.
Maybe you'll read us a little something. What are you going to go for?
I will do. Okay, so I'm actually going to read from the new book, which is the 1930s. And the point really is that the 1920s gave way to an awful decade. So the 1930s was nicknamed the Devil's Decade in Britain, because it began with the Great Crash and it moved into what was the Great Depression in America. Didn't have a name, I think, in the UK. Maybe it was the Great Depression, characterized by enormous unemployment. So 3.5 million men, not people, men, unemployed. And those who were employed, there was no living wage. There really wasn't. There was no minimum wage. People were working and they were unable to feed their families. They couldn't even begin to feed their families. Working people's families were starving. There was an awful lot about rickets and scurvy and other diseases of malnutrition that you wouldn't expect to think about in such numbers in a country like Britain in the 1930s, which is, that's living memory, basically, or very, very close to. So the 1930s was really, was a much more difficult, and then politically and socially, there was the rise of fascism, there was the rise of communism at the same time, kind of battling it out for the hearts and minds of these very disaffected people. And again, so this is a small party that I'm writing about, and it is happening in 1931 in Clandeboy, which is in County Down, and it's the house that Maureen Guinness moved to when she married Basil Blackwood, who was the Marquis of Dufferin and Ava. That was his family home, and so she went up there, and the place was beyond dilapidated. I mean, she poured an enormous amount of money into it, and I believe it's very nice now, but at the time, it was so falling down. They used to do the drips from the ceiling. They would tie string to cornices to guide the drips into a chamber pot. So you were surrounded by these hairy bits of string with like water running down and plonking into chamber pots. And the wallpaper was falling off and there was damp everywhere. And it was really, kind of hardship stations. She has begun bringing people to the house and having these parties, but she's running into trouble in her marriage. And so I'm kind of equating social and political events with the inner events and the inner lives of the three Guinness girls. So at this point, God, I'm going on a long time before I read. Jesus Christ, I apologize. And now I will do the reading. Okay, so she and her friends have just come back from a race meeting that they've been to. And Maureen comes in. Manning, who is the butler, bring cocktails to the drawing room, Maureen called. She pronounced her words carefully, lest it be obvious how much she had been drinking. Instead of going to change, as she usually would, she went straight to the drawing room, heels tapping on the wooden floors, muted every now and again by a rug, so that her progress felt weirdly disjointed. Tap, tap, silence, tap, silence, tap, tap. Behind her, she heard snatches of conversation from the others. A sure winner, that extraordinary little man, almost as teensy as a jockey himself. In the drawing room, Duff, who is her husband, that's what she called him, and his friends, the day's shooting done, sat in deep shadow. They had neglected to turn on the lamps or draw the curtains, and were lit only by the fire on one side and the last grey light of afternoon that struggled through the window on the other. In the furthest corner, Kathleen sat reading by the same bad light. Kathleen is a kind of a helper, friend, companion person. The men were talking in low voices, a decanter set on a small table by Duff's elbow, and they fell silent as Maureen stepped briskly in. Darling, there you are, she said loudly. I need you to adjudicate. She launched into a complicated story, told with extravagant gestures about a betting syndicate that they had made up, with various wins and losses, appealing to him to say where the money should now be disposed. I cannot make head or tail of it, Duff said. Then, Kathleen, Maureen demanded peremptorily, you must decide. I was about to give Caroline her bath, Kathleen said evasively, standing up and moving towards the door. I'll come back. Don't be silly, that's what nanny's for. I do wish you'd stop hanging about the nursery. She's not your child, or have you forgotten? There was one of those sharp little silences then, the kind that maybe fell by accident because everyone somehow stopped talking at once, but then remained a fraction too long because no one knew what to say to follow such a strange remark. It was the kind of silence, Maureen knew, that often followed her these days. Sharp pauses that were filled with all the things others didn't dare say to her. She's not Nanny's child either, Duff said, his words steady and distinct from the other side of the room, although anyone would be forgiven for thinking differently. I'll see her later, Maureen said, deciding to placate, when Nanny brings her down. But something about Duff's silence had made her irritable, so she put a record on the gramophone. When Duff and his friends drew their chairs closer together to continue talking, she turned the sound up higher and began to sway to the music, grabbing a cocktail glass from the tray that Maureen produced. From it protruded an olive on a stick that was like a miniature exclamation mark to her every move.
And maybe just to finish the readings, Selina, you want to do something that is kind of a counterpoint to the Evelyn Waugh story, and it's set in Cork.
I wanted to talk about Bowen's The Last September, and I'm hoping that among the books that people might have picked up in book clubs that you've had the great pleasure of reading this novel, because Bowen writes exquisitely. But towards the end of the book, I should explain that we have Lois, who is a girl of about 17, 18, 19, I think, late teenager. And she lives with Sir Richard Naylor and Lady Naylor, who are effectively an uncle and aunt. And she's taken to the great social event is a dance in the officers' mess being thrown by one of the officers' wives. And these are British soldiers in Cork. It's set in 1920. And they are there to effectively protect a lot of the local aristocracy, gentry, from being burnt out. And every character in this novel knows that the house that they live in is going to be burnt out. It's kind of hangs over the year. So this dance kind of is with these men who have been out on patrol all night and raiding houses, burning, basically committing army atrocities through the countryside of Cork. And they come back and are expected to dance with these kind of local aspirational girls. And it's this kind of mad, bad party, which is all very hackneyed. And there's a character called Daventry who has fought in the First World War. He has shell shock. He has been kind of sent off to Ireland with these auxiliaries. He's a deeply dangerous man, really. And he is kind of at his wits' ends. So I just want to read a little bit about this kind of party, partly because I want to read about the end of it. But Lois is there chiefly to dance with Gerald, who is the subaltern that she's decided that she is going to, she's decided that she kind of wants to marry. Mrs. Rolfe had an idea that the dance might well finish up with a cotillion. She was vague about cotillions, which I think is a kind of dance where people basically whack each other with balloons and tickle each other with feather dusters. I don't think it's any more sophisticated. Yeah, such fun. In an army hut in North Cork in the middle of winter. She was vague about cotillions, but towards this end she had distributed balloons, whistles that ran out long tongues when you blew them, and streamers from striped cardboard battens with which dancers might hit one another over the head. Mrs. Vermont thought these things went better with fancy dress, but Denise said a rag was a rag at any time. Girls ducked and shrieked and waved their streamers over their partners' shoulders. Denise, radiant in black with a trail of nasturtium, was waltzing, an affair of prolonged hesitations, with Betty's husband. She bit off a streamer, spat out a mouthful of paper and said with a shiver of happiness, "Isn't it marvellous, Timmy? I can hardly believe I'm awake." Now, Denise and Mrs. Vermont are both English. So they go on, and Mr. Daventry takes the district inspector's niece off down the passage. If they were not careful, they would knock over the gramophone. Mr. Daventry thought it was time that they did. It was time something happened. He danced the DI's niece down the passage and kissed her with her head pressed back in the coats. She struggled, futile, slippery as a weasel. As he kissed again, her face went stiff and she shut her eyes. When these opened, they were as shrewd as ever. Still, he did not know what she thought. The drums in his temples were now insistent. He could not forget them even while he was dancing. She had dabbed herself over with white rose. Her frizzy hair tickled his mouth as he bent close to her. Do you get kissed a lot? Englishmen never could keep their mouths to themselves. You won't know yourself when we're gone. You should get back home while you can, the lot of you. Anyway, and it goes on. And towards the end, Gerald takes Lois outside and they are there to have a kind of quiet talk. But one of the things about this party is that though it's happening in one of the officers' huts, they've been told that if they stray too near to the perimeter fence, they may well be shot by snipers. So that adds a certain tension to that conversation. So it's just the sense that how one of the things that actually happens in the last September is that hospitality is not just about entertainment, it's not just about occupation, it is also a form of warfare in and of itself, and it's a form of strategy. And so it's such a great novel because actually the loyalties are so finely balanced and the writing is so superb. So anyway, I just wanted to commend it to you rather than just talk about all these, Jeeves and war. Now, we haven't done Agatha Christie, but we should perhaps, that'll come up in questions maybe.
It is brilliant, that book.
Let's do that because we have, believe it or not, we've been talking for almost 50 minutes at this stage, which is...
So sorry.
It flew.
I'm so sorry.
Tell me, does anybody have questions? Let me put my hand up. And it's always the first one is always the killer. Do me a favour, be the first person to put your hand up. There was a gentleman there. You had your hand up, sir, earlier, didn't you?
There are no stupid questions.
There are no stupid questions.
Well, I did think of a question earlier. I was going to ask Emily about the books that you wrote, the Guinness Girls books. And I just wanted to know, did you have a separate kind of narrative arc for both, or was it kind of all one? I know it's it's based on a true story, but did you have separate plans for each?
That's a brilliant question.
It is, and I'm going to repeat it maybe for people who are watching on the live stream and might not have heard that. So the question is about the Guinness Girls books, about whether or not you had separate narrative arcs for both books, or, and maybe I'm paraphrasing you, were you always starting to aim with the idea of telling a longer story that would include both of those sets of decades?
So that is a brilliant question. And yes, I always intended to write both of them, and I wasn't certain where I would end. I just found that there was so much in the 30s that I didn't wish to go any further than that. I did have separate, well, actually, the way it worked out is that they have, the first book has a narrator so everything is filtered through one particular person. She writes in the first person, she lives with the Guinness Girls, she goes everywhere, she's the eyes and ears of the reader into their world. And then I was done with her as a character. Her arc was complete for me at the end of the first book. So when it came to writing the second book, I couldn't dust her down and shove her out again and make her work. I had given her a nice story and I was happy with what she had done. I didn't feel it was right to bring her out of retirement and make her do that job again. So I wrote the second book quite differently, and I decided I would go inside the heads of the three characters alternately, and then a couple of invented, well, one in particular, invented character to give perspective on the privilege of their worlds. Also, I needed somebody, in the first book, they're girls and they live under the same roof, so it's quite easy to encounter all of them together and follow their stories through the eyes of one external person. But in the second book, The Hint of Scandal, they're in 3 separate houses and they're in 2 separate countries. And I don't think I could have sent a single narrator busily all around those different locations. So, and also I felt at that point more able to be inside their heads, you know, and that then had its own kind of narrative logic. And then I got very obsessed with the history. For me, is just as interesting as, like, the broader history is just as interesting as the lives themselves. And the more I read about the 30s, which I knew a lot less about starting out than I did about the 20s, the more I wanted to reflect the kind of insanity of that decade. So that provided the narrative arc for me, because the 30s, as we all know, ends in World War II. Mm-hmm. So what begins in kind of unemployment and rickets and despair ends in this, you know, the war, you know, the next great war to kind of divide and destroy Europe. So that provided a kind of a narrative framework for me.
Genuinely, no stupid questions. Well done. Love that. That's a good start. Who's got something else?
Can I ask, do you think that our view now of the 1920s is very much seen through the lens of kind of the rich and privileged of the time rather than the ordinary person?
Yeah, that's, again, I'll repeat that for if you're watching on the live stream, about our view of the 1920s and whether or not it is viewed through the rich and wonderful and fantastic people as opposed to maybe those people who aren't represented so much in the fiction of the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's another great question that, I mean, definitely I'm guilty of that.
Well, I suppose in a sense that I'm trying to think, I think literary history has privileged, if you like, the writing of that period as kind of, if I think about the modernist writers like Eliot, Woolf, Yeats, others, they're not coming out of, if you like, a 1920s sense of kind of working class solidarity by any means at all. So in a sense, yes, it does. But I think actually in Irish literature, you begin to see, in fact, if you look at the memoirs like Ernie O'Malley's memoirs, or if you go back and, you know, Frank O'Connor is more 1930s than 1920s, but you do actually have that literary imprint where you do find those ordinary lives. And of course, you do find it in Irish, you know, you find it in Robin Flower's accounts. So one of the interesting things to turn that question around, one of the things that shows us is also how incredibly class-bound the publishing industry was. And how, where it thought its readers were. And one of the things that, of course, has changed, it changes substantially after the war, is that you have a profoundly, profoundly literate working class population in both Britain and Ireland, but who are increasingly moving into advanced education. And a lot of that is through kind of what become FE, further education colleges. So suddenly you have a huge readership. And that then begins to change literature, particularly in British literature, particularly during the 1950s. But I think what you have is what we see in the 1920s is the last moment of that kind of fairly snobby, privileged, class-bound publishing industry. But if you go back and you look through press accounts, or you look through periodical literature, or you look through pamphlets and manifestos, or you look at the working class men's unions, and the union movement moved into education pretty strongly as well, you would get a completely different picture. It's just that these are the books that we've chosen to talk about tonight, so that's why we're talking in very rarefied terms. We could have a 1920s that is a totally different kind of literature, but it may not be gorgeously written in that gorgeous, when I say gorgeous, I mean that kind of wealth, that voice of money. It's not written in that way. And that says more about our priorities as readers, perhaps, and that sense of nostalgia than it does necessarily about what was actually going on in the 20s.
Yeah, again, great question. In front of us here.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, you know, you're writing about actual people, real people, and how do you find that balance between, because you're writing fiction, like people who actually existed, do you find that you sometimes get caught up in I can't write this because this didn't happen, and where do you find the line between fact and fiction where you have the creative license to actually go ahead and write about people who actually existed?
Yeah, again, and this is another great question, and one that I've asked writers on many occasions who write books in which there are obviously people who actually really lived. Where's the line? Where's the line between what you yourself feel you can write about these characters as opposed to what actually happened in their real lives? And were there moments where there was something that you wanted to write, but at the same time then felt like you went, I'm just not sure I can do that?
Yes. That's a really great question. That's a fascinating question. So from one end of the scale where you have Hollywood that does, based on the life of, and then takes every liberty under the sun known to humanity, I think we're more comfortable about that happening in film than we are in books. Personally, I would be really uncomfortable if I wrote something that was factual, that I knew to be a lie. So what I tried to do was to create, so the framework of both the Guinness Girl books are entirely factual. If somebody arrives at such and such a time and is, of such and such an age and was born in such and such a place, all of these things are true. So the scaffolding of the books is true. And within that, then, I have given myself the freedom to imagine the thoughts and the conversations and all of these things that are not recorded, and nobody could say whether they are true or not. I have not given myself the freedom to do something that would alter the current reality. So, for example, a really easy example of this is, say I decided that I wanted one of these girls to have a torrid affair before she was married and have a baby that was born out of wedlock, and what happened to that baby? You can't do that, because then that means that you're saying that there is possibly a living person. If you blend fact and fiction, then the logical conclusion is that there could be a living person who is, a kind of a descendant of a genuine person still around today, and that for me doesn't work. I think that you can't do things that change the known realities. So I didn't do any of those. I stayed true to the events. I stayed true to an awful lot of things, like dates of parties, for example, anything I could get that I could substantiate. So, any accounts of them in social diaries and what they're wearing. That's what they're wearing in the book at that party with the people who are mentioned in the newspaper accounts, etc. And then within that, I just gave myself the freedom to make them feel things and do things and say things about their lives that they undoubtedly never did or thought or said. I made them reflect on their lives, probably a lot more than, most of us really reflect on our lives while we're leading them. Which is kind of fun for me and I hope for the reader. But, there's no way that real people go through their lives and, take account of events and, feel the life-changingness of them. That all happens in retrospect. So it's kind of a blend. A lot of it is a judgment thing as well. And, it's just things that feel right psychologically to what you know of a character and the kind of the fact file that you've built up about them and the things that you know to be true and the true accounts of their personality. You can't then make them go and do something that seems completely at odds with what you know of them. So psychologically, I tried to be true to the personalities as I knew them also. But that said, it's a novel, so, I didn't fuss too much if, I made up an innocuous thing and I knew it was made up.
Yeah.
If I could just come in on the back of that, it does raise a very interesting question, which is how many generations have to have gone by before you're permitted to write historical fiction? Because effectively what it is a superbly imagined piece of historical fiction. And we've no problem with Hilary Mantel doing that with Thomas Cromwell. Yeah. So in a way, what is it the fact that it is potentially within our grandparents' generation that provokes unease? But in fact, the methods that you've described are exactly the same, whether you're Hilary Mantel writing about Thomas Cromwell, presumably, or Emily Hourican writing about the Guinness Girls. I mean, you've immersed the amount of research that you've done, the amount of reading back into that period. So it's an interest, again, I say it's an interesting, that question is an interesting way of thinking about the ethics of how much do we allow ourselves to pry into our grandparents' lives? In some ways, I mean, on a psychological level, that in a way is part of it, isn't it? Where do we draw the shutters closed, And yeah, so sorry. That's
I think that's
very
a great
interesting,
place
yeah.
to finish. I think time has caught up on us. I think there are a couple of things I just want to let you know about, either if you're watching online or you're here. There are further events happening that are all 1920s stranded that are happening throughout the rest of the festival, and you can find the details of that on the festival website, as well as the list of books that we started with tonight, the ones that were being read by book clubs all across the South Dublin County Council area and being read by other book clubs around the country. So you'll find that list on this event page on the Redline Book Festival website. And then all that is left for me is to say thank you very, very much to my guests. Thank you to Selina Guinness and thank you to Emily Hourican.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And thank you.